Hello, everyone. My name is Jona PUCİ, and together with two other colleagues, Albana, DEMİ, and Ketrin, ÇUPİ, we're presenting to the conference organized the topic Determinants of Non-Performing Loans, the case of Central and Eastern European countries' commercial banks. The main topics or the main parts of the introduction sections will be focused on the importance of the study. Why did we choose this topic? We'll elaborate on the research questions and the main objective that this study has. Why did we choose this topic? Because, as we know, banks are the most significant financial institutions in the world and are the main ones responsible for the progress of a country's major economic progress and at the same time for potential local and worldwide financial crises. Also, these financial institutions contribute to a country's economic development through their main weapon, which is credit. The rate of growth in non-performing loans relative to total loans is one of the issues that troubles economies of the countries as it reveals a rising insolvency for businesses and individuals and possesses the whole system at risk and eventually the whole country. Therefore, considering this situation and importance of financial institutions, we thought this paper to consist of the analysis of non-performing loans for Central and Eastern European countries. The aim of the study, the objective of the study is to determine the variables, mainly macroeconomical perspective, that affect non-performing loans from 2000 up to 2010. Before moving on the methodology part, how we did conduct our study, we had a look at the literature review, and here are given just some, I have just mentioned some of the authors with regard to the variables that we have selected: unemployment, GDP growth, or the inflation. How do they affect the non-performing loan? Well, what we can say, as a matter of fact, is that decreases in unemployment and increases in GDP do decrease non-performing loans. So there are studies with regard to this topic. Inflation and unemployment affect credit risk, and GDP growth has an inverse relationship. This is what I would say most of the studies indicate. However, there are some other studies from other authors which indicate either an insignificant relationship, either a different relationship. Considering this gap in the literature, we thought to conduct a more, I would say, with a longer sample, such as countries from the Central European, Central East and Eastern European countries, commercial banks. The data that we collected were from 2000 up to 2020. We thought that in this case, the variables to be considered as the ones that affect non-performing loans to be GDP growth, inflation, unemployment, and we thought to consider an internal variable as well, which is return on assets. Why did we choose these variables? First, we started from an economic reasoning, meaning started thinking, economically speaking, what can be those factors that do affect the level of non-performing loans. After that, we had a look at the literature, as showed in the previous slide, to see what are the factors that previous researchers have considered to be mostly relevant. In order to give an answer to the research question that we raised, which is, do GDP growth, or to what extent GDP growth, inflation, unemployment, etc. affect non-performing loans, we raised the following hypothesis. The first hypothesis is GDP growth negatively affects non-performing loans, which means a higher GDP growth, a better off of the society, meaning of the economic growth around. Therefore, we would expect a decrease in non-performing loans. Inflation and unemployment, we expect them positively to affect non-performing loans, as, for example, as the unemployment rate increases, it means that people will start losing their jobs, so most likely they will default on making their payments to the bank, which will end up in an increase in non-performing loans. Lastly, return on assets, which is the profitability measure of the companies, of the banks. we expect negative effect, which means is how well a bank itself can manage, how sound the bank is to afford or to withstand the level of non-performing loans. Before running the regression, there are some assumptions that have to be met in order for the model to be significant, which are the model should be linear, we should test for multicollinearity, we should have a look at the serial correlation and heteroscedasticity. All of these assumptions that we mentioned here are presented in the appendix in the file submitted. If we jump to the analysis of results, the model is linear, so just the summary of the conclusions here with regard to the assumption. The model is linear, considering that the p-value resulted to be higher than 0.5. Also, we did not detect any multicollinearity, considering a p-value 0.02 and lower than 10. A very important component is the Darwin-Watson, which tells us about the serial correlation. Considering that it has resulted to be lower than 2, we can say that is a good result. And homoscedasticity, it resulted in a p-value to be greater than 0.05. Therefore, we can proceed with testing the model. After we test the model with EVU STAN software, this is the outcome that we get. As we see, these are the results for GDP growth, inflation rate, unemployment, and the ROA. The first thing that we have to look at is the Fisher statistic and the probability for the model in general. As we see, Fisher statistic is 9.9 and the probability is 0.000, so it's lower than 0.05, which makes our model significant. Having said this, then we can say that we can use the model for making future predictions or for making conclusions. Now, considering that the model is significant, we can proceed with the variables one by one. So we have a look at the first, which is the first hypothesis, GDP growth. In the hypothesis, we stated that GDP growth is expected to have a negative impact, meaning an inverse relationship. As we see, the variable is negative, so the relationship, the impact is negative. Also, its significance, respective significance, is lower than 0.05. Therefore, we accept the first hypothesis as true. The other two hypotheses, which are related to inflation rate and unemployment, as we see, the p-value for each of these variables is higher than 0.05. From this, we can conclude that these two variables, for this at least study, for this period considered, and for these countries, do not significantly impact the non-performing loans, regardless of the sign. So inflation is with the sign that we expected it, whereas unemployment, no. However, even if we just leave aside the direct of the impact, we have a look at the p-value, which it tells us that these two variables do not significantly impact. Therefore, we conclude that we reject the second and the third hypothesis. The fourth hypothesis was related to return on asset, and we expect, as we raise the hypothesis, return on assets to have an inverse relationship, a negative one. We have a look at the indicator, the sign is negative, and we have a look at the p-value. Its respective p-value is lower than 0.05. Therefore, we conclude that the variable or return on asset has a negative impact on non-performing loans. So we accept two hypotheses and we reject two other hypotheses. Lastly, if we have a look at the R-squared, which is about 69% or about 70%, this gives us some information with regard to how much the dependent variables that we have chosen explain non-performing loans. So we can say that about 70% of the fluctuations in non-performing loans are explained by the variables that we have chosen, the independent variables. So these are the results of our study. Now, lastly, as we saw, two of the hypotheses were accepted and two were rejected. So the hypotheses that were accepted were with regard to GDP growth and return on assets, whereas unemployment and inflation resulted to be insignificant. This does not mean that these two variables do not affect, because this is a statistical test. What I can say is that for the period that we have considered, they resulted not to be significant. But, for example, if we extend a little bit the countries, or if we extend the time frame, or if we take another time period, maybe these variables would result in a significant outcome. What can be done for the researchers or for ourselves, for other studies, is that we can take into account other variables, or we can increase, as I said, the time beyond the frequency. So this was our presentation. Thank you very much.